They lowered him into the ground while the rain pretended to be gentle. People murmured and folded their hands into the dark of their coats. I stood with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee clutched between my fingers, the cardboard softening under the heat, and watched the shovel bite into the soil where Ernest had been, where the steady width of his shoulders would vanish into the earth. The funeral director kept glancing at me with that careful face people wear when they think they know how to measure grief. Doris was at my elbow, her palm on my wrist like a small, precise anchor. The preacher's words blurred into a single soft sound behind the low thump of the casket settling. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I felt it more than heard it, an itch of vibration I couldn't ignore. But I did ignore it until a hand on my arm tightened, and I realized everyone was looking for the prayer card. I dug the device out with fingers that didn't belong to me, and the screen glared like a small accusation. A new voicemail. The little gray text under the caller ID said, "One new message." I put the phone to my ear. The voice that came through wasn't quite his, the cadence of words I'd heard for 43 years, but thinner, younger, as if someone had stolen the weight from them. "Margot," it said. "This is Ernest. I'm still alive." Air left my lungs before the sentence finished. The shovel clanged against metal, as if the world had been given a table to bang on. There was a flurry of movement. A chair scraped. 2 women gasped at once, and someone said, "Did she hear that?" I replayed the message because my ears wanted a simpler world than my memory could hold. The voice came again, distorted by the phone and by something else, urgency or mockery or an attempt to be remembered. "I'm still alive," it said. "Don't let them." The call cut as abruptly as if someone had pinched the wire. For a long moment, I did nothing but stand and hold the phone and breathe shallowly into it until Doris's hand found mine. She looked at me with the open face she'd always kept for neighbors and told me there was someone at the back of the cemetery she thought might be one of Ernest's old men from the shop. I nodded, because nodding is a thing you can do while your world rearranges itself. After the reception, we gathered in my kitchen like people gathered around the stove in winter, out of habit and for the heat of being near one another. Cups were refilled. Someone cut a slice of cake too small to be real consolation. My sons sat on either side of me like bookends I hadn't reached for. Charles with a suit that was expensive in ways that made the thrift in the house glow dimly, and Henry with that restless face of someone who had practiced being contrite and found it did not fit him well. They each told the same stories about Dad. He fixed everything, with different tones. Charles's voice carried a smoothness I had come to know as negotiation. Henry stuttered and came out in bits, as though a piece of him kept falling out the door. It should have been a day for memory and tears. Instead, that message, those 3 words, set my teeth on edge. Ernest had been found on the floor of his shop 3 nights earlier, the paramedics said. He had been lying there without a pulse when they found him. The ambulance lights had painted the corrugated metal in red and blue. They'd declared him dead at the scene. There had been talk then of an accident, slipped, hit his head, complications, and that would have been enough in any ordinary life where the next day and the one after that kept their ordinary shape. But he had never come home from the shop that night, and my mug still sat beside the sink with the gray ring it made when he forgot to rinse it out. Doris caught my eye across the table and mouthed, "Did you listen to the rest?" I shook my head. I couldn't bear to replay it again in front of those faces. Instead, I let the room fill up with other people's grief, the way their shoulders sagged, the small hands that touched mine and walked away, and let my own disbelief sit beneath them like a stone. That night, I sat on the porch where we had always had our morning coffee. The mug was the same chipped thing with the blue rim Ernest liked. His initials scratched into the bottom had started to fade. The porch light hummed over the lattice, and the box of his tools leaned against the shed like a silhouette of his working life. I listened to the message again, alone this time. The voice in the recording was unmistakable once the shock wore off. His tight way of pulling vowels, the habit of dropping the last consonant when he was tired. But it wasn't a normal voicemail. There was a paper trimmer in it, an edge, as if whoever pressed record wanted someone to hear exactly what would not make sense if you waited until the funeral. I remembered the last evening I had seen him alive. He had come home later than usual, a smear of grease on his hands and a new nick on his knuckle where a wire had slipped free. We ate cold chicken in the kitchen, and he told me about a stubborn Pontiac he'd been stuck with all afternoon. I pressed his calloused fingers and asked if he was all right, and he said, "It's just the shop, Margot. You know me." He kissed my forehead like he did when he meant for me to stop fussing. In the dark of the bedroom, I told myself not to be foolish, not to look for omens where none existed. We had been married for 43 years. He had been the sort of steady man you built the unremarkable scaffolding of a life around. The small rituals, the way he folded the newspaper, the mug by the sink, the place he left his keys on the peg by the door. But steady things fracture if pressure is applied at just the right angle. I had seen the first hairline fissure 6 months before his death, when Charles and Henry began to change. At first, it was quiet and plausible enough. Charles started dressing differently, and Henry's work hours shifted to later nights. Visits from Jasmine increased, and she always had a new perfume that left the room smelling of citrus and money. There were also small, sharp things. A new signature on an insurance form, a bank withdrawal that didn't match the ledger we kept in the kitchen drawer, a polite suggestion from Charles about simplifying our affairs. "For ease," he said, "for your peace, Mom." I remember the way he smiled at me like those words were gifts. After Ernest's body was taken from the shop by men in plain uniforms who spoke in whispery, efficient sentences, Charles had moved in. He said it was to help with arrangements, but the help took on a different texture. He arranged to have the bills moved onto electronic statements, citing convenience. He cleaned out drawers under the pretense of getting rid of junk and carried boxes to a lockup in the back of his van. He argued softly with Henry about the best way to manage the shop while the coroner's work unfurled. We can't let things fall apart. The shop was more than a livelihood. It was Ernest's daily evidence that everything had meaning. Watching others touch his sockets and wrenches felt like strangers opening the window to a life I'd once shared. The next morning I went to the shop because being where he had been felt like the only way to begin to understand what had ended him. The bell over the door rang out like a small alarm. Toolboxes sat half open. There was the lingering smell of oil and coffee and the faint metallic bite of iron in the air. On the workbench where Ernest did his fine, patient work sat a notebook open to a page where he'd penciled numbers and tiny diagrams. I traced a finger over the handwriting and felt ridiculous, as if the letters would slide and tell me what had happened. Henry was there, standing by the counter in a jacket he would never have chosen 5 years ago. He looked smaller than he had at the funeral. He avoided my gaze. "We need to get the inventory done, Mom," he said. His voice trembled in a way that made me think of a child balancing on a fence. "Who called the ambulance?" I asked. He swallowed. "Customers. A man came in, found him on the floor. He stopped. His mouth worked like it wanted to spit something out and couldn't. "Did he have any visitors? Anyone leave?" I asked, because questions are tools, and in the early days you use whatever is in your hand. "No, just the morning mechanic who comes in sometimes. He said he found him." Henry's eyes found the floor and stayed there. I didn't have the language then to say what I suspected. I only had that recorded voice insisting between my ribs that Ernest had left an impossible message. I left the shop with the notebook tucked under my arm because small objects keep the truth honest. In the wallet of the notebook, someone had slipped a receipt from the bank, stamped 3 weeks earlier, an oddity I didn't understand until later. There was also a folded paper with Ernest's handwriting on it, a shopping list crossed out, and something else scribbled in the margin. Discuss policy, Charles. I read it twice as if the pen could take me down new alleys of reality. Police were polite, which is different from being forceful. Sergeant O'Connell came to the house that day with files and a clipboard, and a look that said he had seen grief before and preferred it not to complicate things with suspicion. Mrs. Fielding, he said, using my maiden name as if memory could flatten me. We know how hard this is for you. I told him about the voicemail, but stopped short of expecting him to leap. He took the phone from me with the professional care of someone handling evidence, and he played the message on his own device, his face unread. We recorded this for the file, he said. We will look into it. When I asked whether they'd test for toxins, whether the coroner would look at anything beyond blunt trauma, the sergeant let out a breath that tasted like the inside of a clock. We follow the coroner's lead. Right now, it's consistent with a sudden medical event, complications from a fall perhaps. If something else turns up, we will investigate. Those words were a soft, bureaucratic cushion that did not stop the edges of my life from cutting me. I asked for copies of the coroner's preliminary report and was given a form with lines and official stamps. There was no promise there, only process. I took the form home and taped it to the inside of the bottom drawer of Ernest's desk, as if a hidden paper could knot the loose threads into something inevitable. It was Doris who first said the thing that made me look at the people I loved and think of motives. She came by one morning with a thermos of tea and sat on the kitchen stool where Ernest had once leaned to sharpen a pencil. I heard Charles was on at your husband about the life insurance, she said, quiet as if she were naming a sin in a house of prayer. Said it was a pain, all those signatures. Said it would be better if he took care of it. I pressed my thumb into the lip of the cup. He wouldn't. People say things, Doris said, and sometimes they mean them. Her words lodged like a pebble under a shoe. I began to watch the accounts. I called the bank under the pretext of fixing a mistake and found a teller with a patient voice who explained that changes had been made, signatures had been updated, beneficiaries shifted. We need proof of identity, the teller had said, and I supplied the same documents I'd always carried. The bank's records came with polite redactions and a careful unwillingness to be blunt. There were new signatures where my husband's should have been. There were withdrawals that left the shop's account thinner than it had any right to be. I did something then that used to terrify me, arguing with my son. I remember the kitchen light casting a small square on the table and the look in Charles's face when I accused him of taking money. He was collected, infuriatingly collected. We're trying to keep things afloat, he told me. You've been so stressed, Mum. Let us handle it. Let us handle it. Those words were a key. They were what people who wanted control always said. Handle what? I asked. Everything, he said. We thought this would be better. I didn't ask for you to take over my husband's life, I said, and the panicked look in Henry's eyes was more confession than his silence could ever be. He flinched like a man who'd been taught to move when instructed. I filed a complaint at the station a week later and was given the thin, polite choreography of police work, forms, a promise that the coroner would complete the toxicology report, a suggestion to wait. The waiting felt like being in a room where someone else held the thermostat. I had always been the sort of woman who mended rather than tore. I had patched shirts, coaxed seedlings into life, kept the bills in a shoebox that smelled faintly of cedar. But there is a point where the stitch will not hold. The memory of Ernest's voice, alive and frightened on my voicemail, would not let me settle into the ordinary cadence of mourning. Stephen Callahan came recommended by a woman at the hardware store who kept careful notes about who did what in town. He was a private investigator whose name was the kind you give to people when you want to sound decisive but not melodramatic. He had an easy way of speaking and the look of a man who had learned to be patient with people whose lives were breaking. When he sat in my parlor and unfolded his papers, he listened the way people listen when they want to understand how to help. "You've been through this before?" I asked once, because people who wore his calm had to have stories behind them. "More than I'd like," he said, "but every case is its own thing. Tell me about Ernest." I told him what it felt like to have his hand in mine at nights, about the coffee ring in the sink, about the way he hummed when a socket finally opened. I told him about the voicemail and the receipts and the folded note in Ernest's notebook. Stephen took notes with a pen that seemed to make a quiet promise on the paper. "We'll start with the bank, the shop ledger, the coroner's report when it comes back," he said. "We will look at who had motive and opportunity, Mrs. Fielding." "Charles has left the house twice this week with 2 boxes," I said, the thought of those boxes like knots in my throat. "He took things from the shop. He said it was to help." "People who take things often tell themselves they're helping." He paused, choosing words. "I can listen to Ernest's message and see if there's anything to be gleaned from the recording quality, background noise, edits, things like that. But understand, this will not be gentle. It will be about following traces." "Follow traces," I repeated, tasting the clinical word and thinking of my husband's hands. He looked at me with that steady, practical face, and I felt a hope that was the cautious sort, thin but persistent. We began then in the small ways people do. We checked dates and bank statements. We sat in the cafe near the courthouse watching people who owned suits like armor. I photographed the open ledger at the shop with my phone and sent the images to Stephen. I gathered Ernest's letters in a box and labeled the box with his name. The morning the coroner called to say preliminary toxicology had found something unexpected, the world turned a shade colder. "We detected a toxic metabolite consistent with ingestion of an industrial alcohol," the coroner said over the phone with a clinician's restraint. "Further testing will be done." I remember the cup in my hand trembling so hard, I heard the ceramic click against the saucer. The word ingestion landed like a small, slow drumbeat. I walked to the window and looked at the garden where Ernest had planned a rose bed last summer. The soil was soft from the rain. The garden had always been a place where time moved in honest increments. You plant, the seed takes, the bloom is proof. Now the soil felt like evidence. Charles called that evening, and his voice sounded strained in a way that was, for once, not carefully rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "we shouldn't make a thing of this. It'll be fine. Let the coroner do his job." "Someone left a message," I said. "He said he's still alive." There was a silence on the line, like the small space between a test and a verdict. "Don't say things you can't prove," Charles replied finally. "It won't help anyone, Mom." I folded the phone into my palm and looked at the rosebed plans shoved in a drawer. The roses had been his dream. I thought of the voicemail again, and the thinness of the voice, and the way the word alive had been pronounced like an accusation. When Sergeant O'Connell called to tell me he had scheduled a formal statement, his voice was gentler than his manner had been in person. "We will take your concerns seriously, Mrs. Fielding," he said. "If anything comes of the toxicology, we will proceed accordingly." Proceed accordingly. The phrase was a map with thin ink. It promised movement, but not necessarily justice. I had the sense then, in the hush of the phone call, that the world had rearranged itself into 2 kinds of people: those who could stand the inconvenience of a criminal investigation and those who could not. My sons, I suspected, were looking at the inconvenience as an obstacle to be managed. I began to collect my life into folders, like a woman building a raft from her furniture. Photographs of Ernest at the bench, receipts from the bank, the slip from the coroner's office. The recording saved to an old phone that no longer received messages, but still held the proof that kept me awake. I labeled each thing with a small, methodical handwriting I did not quite recognize and tucked them into a leather folder I hadn't used since my bookkeeping days. The folder's weight in my bag felt like a new limb, a tool of action in a life that had been mostly waiting. That night, when the house finally settled into the dim breathing of sleep, the phone on the kitchen table chimed with a different kind of message, a text this time from an unknown number. It read simply, "You were warned." The screen went dark as the message landed. I held the phone until dawn and thought of the recording and of Ernest's hands at the socket and of the stacked boxes in Charles's van. I thought of the roses that had yet to be planted. The next morning, I slipped the folder into my shoulder bag and walked toward the police station with the slow, sure steps of someone who has decided she will not be carried by others but will carry herself. The rain had cleaned the air, and the town smelled of wet pavement and early bread. I pushed the station door open, and the clerk looked up with an expression that read, "You again." I handed over the folder and asked to speak with Sergeant O'Connell. "He's in with the DA," the clerk said, and the words landed like a door closing. I tucked my chin and waited in the narrow hall, listening to the tick of the clock. When the sergeant came into the lobby, he didn't look surprised to see me. He took the folder and opened it with a professional, uninterested motion. He turned to the entry where I had written down the details in that small handwriting and read, "You found this in his notebook?" he asked. "I did," I said, "and I have the messages. I wanted everything on record." He nodded, and for a beat I thought the world might tilt. "We'll add your statement," he said. "There's also been an anonymous tip about possible financial irregularities. The DA is reviewing." The words "anonymous tip" seemed to glide over my heart and scrape. I left the station with the folder still clutched to my chest and felt something loosen, a tiny thing like a screw twisting free. There was momentum now. Someone else had seen the threads. Someone else might pull. I did not know then how far it would go, how the ledger would open like a map to motives, and how the recorded voice would be replayed in a courthouse with strangers watching me keep my seat. I only knew that the shovel at the cemetery had struck something other than dirt. It had struck the beginning of a road I would have to walk alone and with others, a path that would demand I learn the names of papers and signatures and the tone of my own voice when it must stand for truth. I walked home with the rain drying the lines on my face and the idea of Ernest's mug waiting on the counter. In the light of the kitchen, his tools seemed quiet and ordinary, lying exactly where he had left them as if time might be mended by small, exact placement. I laid the folder on the table, turned the key in the lock of the desk where Ernest had kept his receipts, and with fingers that felt steady now, placed the photographs inside. The next morning, I was to meet someone from the bank who had asked to speak to me about signatures. I folded my hands around the mug and listened to the house breathe, knowing the days ahead would require me to listen in a new way. Outside, the roses still waited for a hand to remember them. I poured another cup of coffee and set the mug on the porch rail where Ernest used to rest his elbows and tell me about the cars he'd fixed that week. The porch creaked as if it remembered his weight. I picked up the phone on the table and, before I could stop myself, played the message one more time. The voice said, "I'm still alive." Then the line went dead, and I tucked the photographs into the folder and left for the bank. The woman in the bank led me down a narrow corridor toward a small room with thick glass and a sign that read, "Private Consultation." Her heels whispered on the tile. The waiting area smelled faintly of lemon polish and the kind of paper that never quite gets creased. She asked me to take a seat and went to close the door. For a moment, I sat with the weight of the folder against my knees and listened to my breathing. as if it could steady anything. She returned with a thin file and a pen. "I'm Marjorie Hales," she said, the name falling with administrative calm. "You must be Mrs. Whittaker." She had the sort of face that had learned to be polite without promising anything. I nodded. "We received your request to speak in person," she said, "about signatures." She laid a photocopy of a check on the table, and then another, then a small card with the signature the bank had on file. Ernest's signature, I remembered, had been precise in its slant, shorthand, a quick sweep at the end. On the check, the handwriting seemed hurried, heavier at the beginning, like someone had pressed down to hide an uncertain flourish. "These two were presented within a fortnight of each other," Marjorie said. "This one to a vendor we list as Coleman Supplies. This one to she hesitated, "a contractor's account. We flagged them because they were drawn against Mr. Whittaker's operating account, and the signatures didn't match our records." My throat tightened. "Ernest handled the accounts," I said. "He balanced the books." "We can see that from the ledger entries you provided," she said, "but someone else had access. There were withdrawals and transfers that didn't line up with invoices. Also, your name appears on a few transaction notes as an emergency contact." I hadn't known that. I never authorized transfers. Marjorie's eyes did not soften.
"We have surveillance footage for teller transactions and a log for wire instructions. We can pull those, but given there's already an inquiry from the DA, anything we find will be turned over." She slid a printout across the table. It was a still from the bank's video, grainy but clear enough. A man in a dark jacket leaned against a teller lane, head turned slightly, his profile familiar because I had seen it in the van outside the funeral home. Charles's broad shoulders, the scar at his temple. He had a hat on in the footage, low, but the slouch was him. "He came here 3 times the week before Mr. Whittaker died," Marjorie said. "Once to make a deposit, once to speak with the teller, and once to withdraw. He used a customer card that had been issued to the business account." I looked at the driver in the still and found my stomach dropping. "Charles." She nodded. "We trace most business transactions to a business number or a tax ID. The contractor's account those checks went to is registered under a name that returns to the same address as a storage facility on the east side. The facility's contract name is under Hammond & Sons Construction, but when we cross-checked with county records, there is no active business license for that name." "So shell accounts," I said, the term tasting like someone else's vocabulary, a front. "It appears so," she folded her hands. "The DA called this morning. They're assembling a team. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whittaker, but we may need originals for the forensic document examiner. And if there's any chance you have other receipts, phones, any correspondence, bring them to the station or to us. We'll file an official request to freeze things while the DA looks into it." The folder on my knees felt suddenly fragile, the way papers always do when they become evidence. "You can look at everything," I said. "Take it, use it." Marjorie hesitated, then pushed a card toward me. "If you remember anything else, any odd deliveries, men coming to the house, anyone asking for keys, call this number. And for your safety, maybe don't go back to the house alone for a few days. I know that is not our usual place to advise, but with the DA involved." She folded the sentence away in the direction of professionalism and let me to read it. When I stepped back out into the street, the air had the same seam of cold that rain leaves behind. I walked toward home because that was the easiest place to go, because Ernest's mug sat on the counter in a way that felt like a beacon. On the porch, the mug waited, empty and ordinary. The roses in the bed were still only small nubs of green, the soil dark where I had meant to plant them the week of his funeral and had not. I had not meant to leave the house, but I found myself walking up the path to the rose bed. My hand smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. The earth at the base of the old oak had been turned recently.
A single line of soil had been scraped aside, as if a tentative hand had judged where to press the shovel. That small disturbance in the soft ground felt invasive, like someone had touched something private to see what moved. A sound behind me, metal on wood, made me turn. A voice called, "You look like you could use a hand." It was Nora from 2 houses down, carrying a garden fork and wearing a sweater thrown over evening clothes as if she hadn't planned to do anything, but had put on forgiveness for the day. She set the fork against the fence and leaned back on her heels, watching me as if she were reading a page. "They're all talk at the station," she said, "but you did the right thing bringing the folder. People who keep records get the law on their side, even when everything else is against them." "You weren't at the funeral," I said. "I had to work," she said, without apology. "But I came to the wake. I brought that bread with the seeds on top. Your sister was not being sensible. And listen," she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I saw a van that week, the week before, parked near the corner for a long time, middle of the day. Charles looked like he was speaking to someone off a list of boxes. I thought nothing of it until now." "Charles," I said again. It felt like testing a word by echoing it. She looked at me hard. "Don't let them make you the one who keeps quiet because you're the widow. You have a voice. Use it. If someone comes around saying, 'Put down the shovel,'" she tapped her fork into the ground twice with a sound like punctuation, "you don't. You don't put down the shovel." Her practical fervor steadied me in a way the bank's careful sentences had not. "Thank you," I said, "for the bread and for saying so." That night, the text came again. It arrived after dinner, sliding into the dark of the phone screen like a small animal. This one was different. No words, only a photograph. I turned it on, and the image bloomed. A picture of the rose bed, taken in daylight, the soil still moist. But in the middle of the bed, planted where the earth had been scraped earlier, was a single white rose. Not a photograph of me at the bed, no hand, no person, just the bloom, open like a mouth. Under the picture, a caption in plain white letters, "Not yours." Something in me folded inward and then hard. Whoever had taken this photo had been close enough to the house to know the smallest details. They had planted a rose where I had meant to. The message was not a threat, not exactly. It was a possession, a statement that this small space could be occupied by someone else. The calling card in the alley, the text that said "You were warned," the photograph, all these things pressed against me like a promise I hadn't asked for. That the world had begun to rearrange itself around Ernest's death, and that I would be the map reader. I placed the phone face down on the table and took a breath. My hands were steady now. If someone thought they could scare me into silence, they had misread the ledger of my life. I slept poorly and woke early, the house still smelling faintly of coffee. There were 2 knocks at the door before dawn. Light had not yet softened the sky. I opened it to find Sergeant O'Connell standing with a man in a dark suit behind him. "Morning," the sergeant said, which meant, in his vocabulary, "We have something." The man in the suit introduced himself with the small, well-buffed motions of a prosecutor. "Deputy Attorney Marlowe," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitaker. We need to speak with you about Ernest's accounts and the ledger you found." "Of course," I said. He took a step into the kitchen and looked at the counter, the mug, the folder of photographs tucked under a placemat like a thing that needed to be acknowledged but not disturbed. "I don't want to alarm you," he said, "but we've had another anonymous tip. It corroborated what your bank found. We may be subpoenaing records. Also, we want to talk about the recording you have." My pulse rose. "It's on an old phone," I said. "I can bring it." "We'd like to make a copy," he said, "and we would request that you not distribute it. It will be evidence." I felt in that request the shape of something larger, The recording that said I'm still alive could be a bridge from private grief to public case. It could turn a question into proof. Will I have to testify? I asked. Possibly, he said. At the very least, we'll need your statement on the record. The more cooperative you are, the better we can protect you. And if there are any immediate threats, he looked pointedly toward my phone on the table, tell the sergeant. O'Connell's hand rested on the screen of the phone as if to claim it. And Mrs. Whitaker, he said, softer, if anyone approaches you asking you to drop this, tell us. When they left, the house felt smaller. The curtains moved a little in the draft and cast lines across the floor like the bars of a room. I took the old phone from the drawer where I had kept it since the coroner's slip had told me about the call. The device felt ancient in my palm. I remembered the first time Ernest had shown it to me. He was proud of how it sat in his hand, the buttons lined up like teeth. He had loved mechanical things, the way people love small, faithful animals. The message was short. The voice, low, close, not quite comfortable with its own composition, had said, I'm still alive. I played it again and again until the cadence was a groove I could hum. There was a pause after the words, then the line went dead, as if someone had hung up to preserve their secrecy. I made a copy of the recording and wrote down everything I could remember about the call, the time, the way the voice had sounded like it was inside a cellar, the slight hiss of a fan in the background. I labeled the copy in the folder with steady, dart strokes. The act of writing was both a protection and a claim. This thing belonged to the truth now. That afternoon, I went to the storage facility Marjorie had mentioned because the bank had been a place of corridors and careful smiles, and because anything that carried Charles's van near it needed to be seen with my own eyes. The facility sat back from the road behind a fence and a sign that complained about trespassers. The man at the office desk had a name tag that read George and a boredom that made him kindly in a way. I asked if anyone had rented a unit under Hammond and Sons Construction. He squinted at the computer and then at the paperwork I'd brought. There was a unit rented, he said, up until 2 months ago. The name on the contract matched an address in town. Name of the renter? Charles Hammond. The word hit like a small, expected stone. Did anyone pick up recently? I asked. He tapped the keyboard, the machine answering with a hollow clack. There was a request to remove items. There is a receipt, signed here. He slid a copy across. The signature looked like a quick scrawl, no flourish, like someone on a bad day. The date was 2 days before Ernest's funeral. I walked the rows of metal doors with their numbers in black, feeling the small wind of the place. Somewhere inside, boxes waited, stacked and neutral. The scent of dust and machine oil made my eyes sting. I imagined Charles's van here among others, the tailgate down, the boxes shifting in transit like soft bones. I thought of the photograph of the roses and the white bloom someone had left in my bed. Whoever had planted it knew how to arrive early and leave a message that would be read. At the end of the second row, leaning against Unit 214, a delivery slip was pinned to the steel with a magnet. It was a plain thing, a date, a name, a signature. Someone had scrawled a note across the margin in blue ink, removed by order, then a phone number below. I took a photo with my own phone. The cold, efficient sunlight made the metal door shine. I had a photograph now. The bank didn't have, the storage facility didn't mean to give me, and the DA might want. The numbers lined up, the checks, the van, the storage, the photo on my phone of a rose planted where I had planted one. When I drove home, the streetlights were coming on like witnesses arriving late. I parked and sat for a long time with the engine running, the radio drowned out by the press of all the things I knew and all the things I did not. The house welcomed me with the ordinary draft through the windows and the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the sort of noise that pretends stability. On the porch rail, beside Ernest's mug, someone had left a strip of paper folded into a boat. Inside, in hurried black ink, a single sentence: "Leave it alone." I did not fold the paper back into the boat or let it sail into the gutter. I put it in the folder, next to the signatures and the photograph and the copied recording, and I decided I would not leave it alone. The folder grew heavy in my shoulder bag as I went inside. It was a burden and a shield. I put the kettle on, and while I waited for the water to boil, I thought of the roses that still waited to be planted in the earth where Ernest wanted them. I thought of the ledger and how graves sometimes opened like books. I thought of the voice that had said, "I'm still alive," and how that sentence could be a confession, a lie, a lifeline. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights like thoughtful eyes. I did not know who was watching me, but I knew that watching, now that it had been noticed, was part of the work. The phone buzzed on the counter, an unknown number, then another. I let them ring out. At 10:30, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Pastor Ellison on my doorstep, his collar slightly rumpled, as if the day had pressed him. Behind him, he carried a small potted plant wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you could use some company," he said, "and I brought something for the earth." He smiled in a way that did not pry. "People have been nervous with all the talk. I told them to let you lead. We stand with you, but you lead." I took the plant. It was a rose, small, a stubborn thing in a pot. Its stems were thin and promising. "Thank you," I said. He looked at the folder peeking from my bag, and for once the words pastor and business and investigation came together in his face with an odd steadiness. "If you need a ride to the DA," he said, "or someone to sit with you while you wait, call me." As he left, the house felt, for the first time in days, like a place that had more than one person in it. The roses waited in a new pot on the counter, patient with possibility. I put the kettle back on and made tea. I set the potted rose on the porch rail next to Ernest's mug and thought of all the small acts that meant, in different hands, something different: planting, stealing, threatening. I had a folder, a recording, surveillance stills, a bank's concern, and the DA's interest. I had Nora's blunt care and Pastor Ellison's quiet offer. I had a white rose in the bed and a photograph that said, "Not yours." Outside, the streetlight hummed and a car went by. Inside, I folded my hands around the mug and listened to the house breathe, like something tired and ready to begin. I would sleep, and in the morning I would go to the DA. I would bring the phone, the copies, the folder. I would show them the ledger and the photograph of the roses and the storage receipt. I would not be the woman who put down the shovel. There was danger, yes. There was a person or people prepared to tell me with flowers and texts to stop. But there was also a path of paper and recorded voices that could be followed by others who were already moving. The town had begun to turn its head. I opened the folder and arranged the photographs on the kitchen table. The white rose in the photo looked almost luminous. The recording sat on the bench like a small animal kept from harm. I listened to the kettle whistle and then let the sound fade. I would go where this road led. I had already begun. Dawn came thin and polite, as if apologizing for the night's alarms. The roses on the porch were rimed with dew. The potted one Pastor Ellison had brought looked like a promise that had kept waking up. I wrapped the folder in a sweater and took it like an offering. Ernest's mug left a dark ring on the rail that matched the bruise under my ribs. On the drive into town, the radio skimmed past a weather report and landed on a hymn no one chose to sing. It felt like a placeholder for courage. People were walking dogs, taking children to school, folding ordinary lives around the rumor of the night before. I kept seeing the strip of paper folded into a boat. Leave it alone. It had the casual cruelty of a hand grazing a wound and moving on. I had not meant to become a lighthouse in a storm, but there it was. Light, duty, a thing that demanded to be seen. The county building sat low and competent against the light, plate glass windows frowning over a flag that didn't quite flap. Inside, the security guard made a small, efficient theater of his questions. I answered with the folder on my lap and the sense that the paper inside carried not only signatures, but a weight of attention. There were forms to sign, a desk to steady myself on, a weight that felt like waiting for a verdict. Ms. The deputy's name tag read Martinez. He had the careful neutrality of someone who had been asked to keep secrets for a living. He led me down a carpet that smelled faintly of lemon and deliberation to an office where the DA sat behind a desk of dark wood and small, significant clutter. Legal pads, a mug that said "Trust but Verify," a framed degree that looked carved into the wall. "You're early," she said without looking up. "Not many people choose to start trouble at 8 on a Tuesday." Her voice was a scalpel in a room of gauze. I put the folder on the desk and unbuttoned the stiffness out of my hands. "I don't want to start trouble," I said. "I want to stop what looks like a pattern." She finally lifted her head, and for a moment I saw the calculation in her eyes. Risk, press, time, the ever-present calendar. "Tell me what you have," she said. I told her. I spoke of white roses placed where they did not belong, of a ledger with names and amounts that did not belong together, of a storage receipt with a number that matched an unlocked unit, of the voice on my phone saying a sentence that was both threat and confession. I handed her the copies, the photograph of the luminous white rose, the storage receipt with its barcode smudged like an accusation, the copied recording. I watched her face as if it were a page I could read. She listened without blink. Then she played the recording. The voice on the speaker was close and dry and smaller than I had imagined. My throat tightened when I heard it out loud. The DA moved through the evidence like someone tracing the edge of a wound. "This is thin," she said when the recording ended. "It is also specific." She tapped the ledger and the photograph together. "Do you have more? Any surveillance?" I had a copy of one, still, a car in the dead purple of surveillance, headlights like the eyes of a thing trying to look human. I handed it over. She squinted at the pixel and at the date. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From the storage facility. I asked to see the unit. The owner claims he doesn't know, says customers come and go." I said the last phrase like a question and watched the map of her face. She reached for the phone, then set it down. "I can get a subpoena for the storage records. We can ask for camera footage, though those are often looped or wiped after a week. If this ledger links payments to municipal accounts or to a charity account, we can trace money. You realize, of course, that once we open this, there will be people who don't like being investigated." "I know," I said. "That's why I brought copies." She leaned back. The office softened around her like paper when it is folded correctly. "I'll sign for a warrant to preserve evidence. I'll authorize an investigator to accompany you to the facility if you want to go now. We can keep this quiet for as long as the law allows." I felt my mouth move before my fear had time to speak. "I want to go now." Outside, the town had not yet decided if it would be curious or cruel. Pastor Ellison sat in his car across the street, his hands folded over a Bible on his knee. Nora stood by the courthouse steps, hair pinned back, arms crossed like someone ready for a fight. They both nodded when they saw me. The DA gave me a small, unexpected smile. "You're not alone in this," she said. And then to Martinez, "Get Detective Hargrove." Detective Hargrove arrived with the careful gait of someone who understood the smell of trouble. He was older than the television detectives, with a cardigan that looked as if it had seen winters but had not been defeated by them. He listened as though he had been waiting for such a mystery, someone to hand him the other end of a rope. At the storage facility, the rows of metal doors stood like teeth in a grin. The manager, a man with a sunburned neck and a pen stuck to his ear, seemed surprised and rehearsed. He produced a clipboard and then produced nothing else. Hargrove asked for the access logs. He produced a paper that had been written in the same hand, neat, with marginalia that looked like a person's attempt at not being noticed. Hargrove ran his finger down the column. "Here's someone coming in at odd hours," he said. "Here's someone paying cash with envelopes." He was the kind of man who could make a data point sound dangerous. They escorted us to the unit. The lock was new. The key turned with the reluctant sigh of something that had kept a secret for too long. The door rolled up and the smell came first. Dust, cedar, the faint perfume of floristry. Inside, crates were stacked like small altars. There were boxes labeled in shorthand, and on a lower shelf, a wooden crate that had been reopened. Beneath tissue paper, there were bundles of stems, preserved and bleached the hollow color of things kept for display rather than life. I took a breath that tasted like someone else's choices. The white rose from the photograph was not among them, but there were traces, a crushed petal, a smear of sap. Someone had staged or had been staging flowers to mean something more than flowers. Hargrove looked at me with a question that did not need words. "You sure you want this?" "I'm sure," I said. My fingers brushed the folder in my bag and received the steady weight of it like a benediction. On the porch of my house, a potted rose awaited, but here, among crates and echoes, I felt the shape of what this had to become. Not a private grief, but a matter that would out itself in paper and law, and perhaps, if we were careful, in justice. We sealed the unit. The manager signed a paper with hands that trembled just enough to be human. The DA's office would take fingerprints, run DNA if it became necessary. The ledger would be traced through banks and shell accounts. It was small administrative heroism, warrants, subpoenas, the slow machinery of proof starting to turn. Outside, the sky had cleared to a thin, honest blue. Nora reached up and touched my arm as if to anchor me in the ordinary for a moment. "Good," she said. "Keep going." "I will," I answered. The folder was back against my shoulder, heavy and steady. The town watched us pass. Some looked away. That felt like an opening. As we drove back, Pastor Ellison's car fell into the lane behind us. There were many ways to guard a space. Locks, laws, witnesses, roses. I thought of Ernest's bed of earth, waiting unplowed or unplanted. I thought of the white rose in the photograph, luminous and impossible. I thought of the strip of paper folded into a boat and the hand that left it. We were beginning. The folder was a map and the people around me were the compass. I did not know where the road would end, but I had decided not to fold the paper back into a boat and let it float away. We drove in silence for a while, the town unspooling itself in small, ordinary movements. I looked at the rearview mirror and saw Pastor Ellison's head bent in what might have been prayer. Nora's jaw set in a line I had seen before when she read a page she could not ignore. Detective Hargrove cleared his throat. "We'll set up a sting if we can get a live bait," he said. "A decoy delivery, a monitor drop. Whoever's running this prefers messages. People who prefer messages will act when they think the message is received." "And if they think we're baiting them?" Nora asked. "Then they'll show themselves one way or another," Hargrove said. Either they won't take the bait, or they'll take it and we'll meet them with light. Light. It felt literal and metaphorical at once. We had brought a small part of it into being that morning. Subpoenas, a sealed unit, a detective who had looked at a ledger and not dismissed it. Outside, the town went on being itself, and inside me, something settled, a plan, a thing with edges. At home that night, I dug a hole in the soil next to Ernest's mug. The earth was cool and smelled of rain that had not yet come. I pressed the roots of the small rose Pastor Ellison had given me into the bed and filled the soil back over them with hands that had not trembled when the door opened at the storage unit. I planted it as if it were a promise, and as if promises could be planted. When I stepped back, the plant seemed smaller and more vulnerable than the folder had, but it was alive and set in a place that had belonged to someone who had loved it. The streetlight hummed like a witness adjusting its gaze. I went inside and made tea and sat with the folder on the table, the town's slow engines of law beginning to stir in the morning. We had begun to follow the thread. The thread tugged, and we would not let it go.